Welcome to another edition of the Law and Gospel Devotional. My name is Erick Sorensen, and each week we gather to look at God's two words from all of the Scriptures, both His Word of Law, which tells us what we ought to do and points out the ways in which we have fallen short, and of course His Word of Gospel, which is ultimately fulfilled for us in the person and work of Jesus Christ. This week I'm coming to you from Camrose, Alberta, at the Canadian Lutheran Bible Institute, where I am teaching a week-long course on the Gospel of Luke. I've just gotten through my first day here and had a blast doing so. Looking forward to the rest of this week, as not only do I get to teach on the Gospel of Luke, but I get to teach all about the great truths that were recovered during the Reformation, and it's entirely appropriate for me to do so because, of course, this Sunday is the Sunday set aside in the church for us to celebrate the Reformation. This is Reformation Sunday coming up because, of course, the very next day is actually Reformation Day, a day that most of us tend to refer to as Halloween and probably will celebrate by going out and trick-or-treating and doing all manner of things with our kids and that sort of thing, which I'll certainly be doing. But it was also on that day that Martin Luther pounded his 95 Theses into the Wittenberg Castle Church door. Really just a series of articles that he wanted to discuss and debate. Had no idea that it would become what it became, that it would spark a legit reformation in the church. But in the providence of God, that's exactly what happened, and here we are 505 years later, celebrating that event every year on October 31st, or in this case, this Sunday, October 30th. And what I want to do with you today is I want to look at one of the lectionary texts from this upcoming Sunday that celebrates the Reformation, and we're going to be looking at the New Testament epistle text. Specifically, we're going to look at Romans chapter 3, verses 19 through 28. Now, it is no secret that Luther really spoke fondly of this book, and it was very essential in bringing him to the place where he would, in fact, start to debate some of the issues that were being taken for granted in the church of his time. In fact, he loved this passage so much that he called it the heart of the Bible. Romans chapter 3, verses 19 through 28, called the heart of the Bible. And the reason that Luther would call this passage the heart of the gospel and therefore the heart of the Bible is because quite possibly more than any other passage, it answers the most important question of the Reformation. And folks, it is true. If you want to narrow down what the Reformation really was all about, is, of course, there's discussions about the role of government, and so you had the two kingdoms doctrine developed, and you have discussions about a theology of glory and a theology of the cross. There's all sorts of other things. There's a great recovery of the doctrine of vocation that I think is hugely significant in world history. But what the Reformation was really fought over, what all the debate was really about, was how a sinner could be saved by a holy God. That's really what it all came down to. Or to put it in another way, how is it that God can acquit us and make us fit for His kingdom? Because if you really think about it, there's no other question that we need answering more than that one. That is the question that determines heaven and hell, life and death. It really is the main thing. Can a sinner be made right with God, and how will that happen? Well, of course, there's been many proposed answers throughout history, and certainly in the history of the church, there were a number of proposed answers. The most common one basically goes something like this. Well, as long as my good outweighs my bad, then I'm assuming that I will be saved. And this is the old God judges on a curve, God judges on a scale type thinking. And to some degree or another, most people inherently believe that somehow, some way, our obedience is what will save us. That's really what this formulation espouses, that it's going to be our obedience that saves us. But of course, the primary purpose of the law, and I know it's counterintuitive, but it is in fact something we talk about here all the time, again, because the Scriptures describe it this way. The primary purpose of the law is not to make us, quote, obedient, but in fact to show us our disobedience. I cannot emphasize this enough. Its primary purpose is to, in fact, show us our disobedience. Listen to what Paul writes at the beginning of our passage in Romans chapter 3, verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. Why? Here's a purpose clause. So that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Do you hear that? The law speaks to those under it, and everyone naturally is born under it, and says, you have no excuse. You cannot flap your gums in your own justification. You have to admit you are guilty. Or the way Paul says it here, that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Yes, that's the purpose of the law. And so the idea that we're going to sort of have our good outweigh our bad is just not, it's a non-starter, because the law doesn't judge that way. The law doesn't judge by whether your good outweighs the bad. It judges in terms of perfection or imperfection. And when the law comes to us, it clearly shows us the many ways that we qualify as imperfect. And so there have been other ways that people have tried to answer this question, which is, well, just do the best you can and you'll be saved. You know, this is the old Benjamin Franklin, God helps those who help themselves. Or, you know, the Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saints Church, who said, just essentially do the best you can and grace will cover the rest. It's a very common way of thinking, even within Christianity, that as long as we do the best, then we'll be okay. And the reason that is appealing to us, the reason that that's appealing to all human beings, is because in the final analysis, we want an attainable law. Once again, though, when we do that, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees of Jesus' day did, we misuse that word. Listen to what Paul writes in Romans 3, verse 20. For by works of the law, and that's all works, folks, for by works, period, no human being will be justified in God's sight, will be declared righteous in God's sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. You see, folks, the law is there as a mirror and gives us knowledge of the ways we've fallen short. It is a mirror pointing out to us how we have failed. So no, it doesn't matter if you just do the best you can, or it doesn't. And the idea that God helps those who help themselves is nonsense. Again, we're not judging on a scale of good versus bad. We're judging on a scale of perfect versus imperfect. A while back, I caught an essay by a guy named John Dink. I've never met him, and we follow each other on Twitter, I believe, but I haven't had any interactions with him. But one time he talked about the sin of preaching cheap law, what he called cheap law. And what he meant by that was a law that seemed attainable to us. And I just loved what he wrote so much that I figured I'd share with you an excerpt today. He writes, cheap law weakens God's demand for perfection, and in doing so breathes life into the old creature and his quest for a righteousness of his own making. And what I'm telling you is this: what doesn't kill him makes him stronger. Lowering the bar lets the old Adam peek into the promised land. It allows the flesh to survive by rebelling in a form of external piety. Whoo, man, is he putting his finger right on the pulse of the problem. Cheap law tells us that we've fallen, but there's good news. We can get back up again. It makes the empty promise of resurrection through our improvement instead of our death. Preach, John, preach, because too often this is, in fact, the way the law is preached, not the way that Paul describes here in Romans 3:19 and 20, and therefore leads people to believe that it's just a matter of them improving a few little things in their life and tweaking a few things here and there, and then they'll be okay, and it is deadly. But no, folks, the reality is the law is picky. As much as we may not like it, as much as we may bristle against it, the law doesn't give any wiggle room to us in matters of how we're made right with God. It's just the reality. It demands 100% righteousness. I've shared this story many times before, but I'll share it here. There was a number of years ago, I was driving on a quiet suburban street, and I came to a crosswalk, and I stopped right at the crosswalk. And just as soon as I passed through the crosswalk, and I legit did stop, I saw sirens behind me. Now, they didn't actually make any noise, but I saw the lights. And so I pulled over my car, sort of mystified as to what the problem might be, and I asked the cop if maybe I had, a taillight out. No, didn't have a taillight out. Asked him if there was some other problem with the car. No. But what it was, the officer said, is that my front tires were on the front line of the crosswalk. Now, they weren't in the crosswalk, but my front tires were on the front line of the crosswalk. In other words, I hadn't stopped just before the crosswalk line, just a few inches. Now, I didn't even know that was a problem. There was no one else in the area. There were no people walking in the crosswalk, and there was no other cars around. And so I was pretty miffed about this. And after the officer gave me my ticket for putting my tires in the crosswalk, I called a police officer friend of mine, and I said, "Can you believe this? I just got a ticket for my tires being on the crosswalk line." And instead of my officer friend sympathizing with me, the first thing he said to me was, "Well, were your tires on the crosswalk line?" And I said, "Well, yes, they were, but just by, I guess, a few inches." And he said, and then I tried to explain myself, and he said, "Wait, but Eric, were your tires on the crosswalk line?" And I said, "Yes, they were." And I started going into my self-justifying ways again, and why I didn't deserve a ticket. And my officer friend interrupted me and said, "Eric, the reality is I wouldn't have given a ticket for that. Most officers wouldn't have given a ticket for that. But he is within his rights to give you a ticket for that because technically that is a violation of the law." That is the way the law works. You can fight the law, but the law will win when you stand before the courts of God. You have no chance of justifying yourself according to the law. And Paul wants to make that abundantly clear so that we see very clearly that we must be saved by someone outside of us. And that is, in fact, the good news, that someone outside of us has come. As the Apostle Paul will write in verse 21, "But now the righteousness of God, the justification that God needs to bring us, has been revealed or manifested apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift." Yes, how are you justified, dear Christian? As a gift. As a gift. Let me say again, as a gift of his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Yes, this answers the question that the reformers were wrestling with all their soul over, that Luther was plagued by day in and day out. It is through faith in Jesus Christ, and it is all a gift of the grace of God. This caused everything to change, and this conviction that what Paul wrote here was true caused the Reformation to blaze white hot with zeal. Yes, we are justified by his grace alone as a gift. Yes, we are justified by Jesus Christ. Why? Why? Because Jesus Christ had offered himself as a propitiation for our sins. Look at what it says in verse 25. God put forward Christ as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. Now, that word propitiation is very important because it was the same word used in the Old Testament for the mercy seat over the Ark of the Covenant. Now, what was the mercy seat? Well, when the priest would go in on the Day of Atonement and would go near the Holy of Holies, he would go by the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant would be that mercy seat. And in order to atone for the people's sins, he would sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on top of the mercy seat. And by the blood being applied to the mercy seat, mercy was then applied to God's people. That same word is used when we hear the word propitiation. By the blood that Jesus Christ offers on the behalf of sinners like you and I, God is atoned and therefore satisfied and offers us mercy by faith in Jesus Christ. Yes, as Paul says, it's a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. Where does faith come from? Well, it turns out even that is a gift of his grace, according to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Why did God do it this way? Very important. It says this was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Yes, justice and mercy meet perfectly at the cross of Christ. At the sacrifice of Christ, both God's justice is exalted and his mercy is exalted for the sake of you and I, sinners that desperately need his mercy. Luther put it this way: our most merciful Father, seeing us to be oppressed and overwhelmed with the curse of the law, sent his only Son into the world and laid upon him all the sins of all men, saying, you be Peter, that denier, Paul, that persecutor, blasphemer, and cruel oppressor, David, that adulterer, that sinner who ate the apple in paradise, that thief who hung upon the cross, and briefly, you be the person who has committed the sins of all men. See, therefore, that you pay and satisfy for them. Yes, dear friends, that is what Jesus Christ has accomplished for us because we could not satisfy the demands of the law ourselves. He had to do it for us in every way. And again, what Christ has accomplished for us must be received by faith apart from works. Verse 22 says, through faith in Jesus Christ, for all who believe, this is applied. And verse 28 says, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. And so when we look at the reason for the Reformation, and we look at this passage that Luther says is the heart of the Bible, we can see now why that is, because the solas of the Reformation are all covered in here, that we are saved by grace through faith on account of Christ alone, and that is where we can find assurance, and that is where you will find assurance, dear friends, as you head out of here for the rest of the week and into your Reformation weekend. May God richly bless you. May you have a great week. I will see you next Tuesday as we dive back into 1 Corinthians.